What's up, everybody? Today we are talking about vocal registers. Vocal registers can generally be described as a series of pitches that sound and feel similar in the way that they're produced. Throughout the years, there has been a lot of words and confusing terminology thrown around: chest, head, mix, middle register, falsetto, whistle, because there are constantly new methods coming out with how to describe the vocal registers. I read this very cool 50-page journal article about vocal science. It's very exciting, by two guys named Thurman and Welch, who have developed this really cool vocal model. So I've kind of adapted that model for our purposes and changed it just a little bit, but we're going to use that today to describe the vocal registers. There are two primary registers that most people sing in most of the time. The low notes are felt primarily in the chest register. Put your hand on your chest and say, "I am a scary giant." Now, you probably felt a series of vibrations in your chest. Even now, as I'm talking, I can feel those vibrations so strongly in my chest. This is what we call the chest voice, or the chest register. People often describe this as strong, deep, rich, powerful, sometimes heavy, or even belty. You hear this all the time in popular music. Cue Adele. Never mind, I'll find someone like you. Beyoncé. Remember those walls I built? Baby, they're tumbling down. Blake Shelton. We turn the dirt and work until the week's done. You'll recognize the sound of the chest voice, usually based on its weightiness and its power. Higher notes are generally felt in what we usually call the head register. That's because it usually feels like the vibrations are sort of coming from the head. If you put your hands on your cheekbones, say like an owl, whoo, whoo. In the chest, the vibrations are super strong. You can really feel them through your hands. With the head, it's more like this sensation that the sound is sort of originating from the head area. This voice is usually described as thinner, pure, light, sometimes softer. Singers that are known for singing a lot in the head voice are Julie Andrews. I could have danced all night. I could have danced all night. Billie Eilish. When I'm coming home and I'm on my own. Prince. Just leave it all up to me. Michael Jackson. And countless others. For men in particular, you have, in addition to the head register, a falsetto register that exists partially in the same range. We'll get to that in a little bit. Let's try this. Put one hand on your chest and one hand on your face. We're gonna do a siren, which is just a long noise that goes all the way up and down. What do you feel? If you're like me, you may have felt the sensation start in the chest, slowly rise up to the head, and sort of make its way back down again. There's a really old diagram that is from like the 1800s, I think, that describes this experience of the different notes in the body almost coming out of very specific different places. This is, of course, perception. There's really no other place that these sounds can originate from except for the vocal folds. But it feels like the notes are on this spectrum of sensation that goes all the way from the chest to different places in the head. Sometimes it even feels like it's coming out the top of the head at the very, very top of one's range. Now, this is really most of what you need to know, especially about the head and the chest registers. You'll be singing in these registers most of the time, and for guys, you have the addition of the falsetto. But it is a little bit helpful to know a little bit more about why they exist and why this happens. To do that, we need to understand just a little bit of science. There are two major muscles that control how the voice goes up and down. Remember the rubber band analogy that we talked about in the vocal fold video? As we sing higher, the muscles lengthen and thin the fold. There's a specific muscle that controls this process. We're gonna call it the light muscle. As we sing lower, the vocal folds get thicker and they get shorter. The muscle that is used to control this process, we're gonna call the heavy muscle. These muscles, of course, have real names. The heavy muscle is, in reality, the thyroarytenoid muscle. The light muscle, in reality, is the cricothyroid muscle, but we are not gonna worry too much about those names, so we'll just call them the heavy and the light muscle. 90% of the time, these muscles work together. In the head register, the light muscle has pretty much dominant control over the process, but the heavy muscle is still involved. And in the chest register, the heavy muscle gets to dominate most of the process, but the light muscle is still involved. Dr. Dan Robinson describes this sort of like the bicep-tricep involvement, that when you're moving your arm up and down like this or lifting something, they kind of give way to each other. There's sort of like a tug of war, but they're both involved, and that's really, really important. So if these muscles work together 90% of the time, what about the 10% of the time when they don't work together? I like to call these the 100% club, because each of these registers uses 100% of one muscle or the other. The vocal fry is below the chest voice. It happens when the light muscle lets go completely and only the heavy muscle is involved. It sounds like this. We don't really use this a lot in singing except for maybe some vocal effects. And in California, sometimes we like to end our phrases like this. We kind of want to stay out of vocal fry range if possible. The opposite of this is where the heavy muscle completely lets go and we're only using the light muscle. Now, this sort of happens differently in the male and the female voice, which is why there's two different registers represented here. In women, the flute register happens above the head voice. It's those super high notes like the one in Mozart's Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute. It has a dotted border because we're not sure if everybody can access all of those notes. Yeah, it still doesn't work for me. The register in the male voice that uses 100% light muscle is called falsetto. This also happens above the head voice, but it has that little tail on the diagram because men can bring their falsetto down pretty low. It can go all the way through their head register and even down into parts of their chest range. So while chest register is generally pretty easy to distinguish, how can we tell when a guy is singing a note in head voice versus falsetto if it's on the same pitch? Well, the two registers have both a different sound and a different feel. The sound of falsetto is generally a breathy one. This happens for complex anatomical reasons. The head voice, in contrast, generally has a more connected, pure sound, and there's less breath in the tone, usually close to none. The feel of them are different too. The head voice generally feels very connected to the rest of the vocal range and also feels pretty grounded in the body. The feel of falsetto is generally one of being pretty floaty and disconnected. My understanding is that the feeling of falsetto for men is most similar to the lightness and the floatiness of the voice prior to the voice change. Now, while flute register usually has to be learned for girls, falsetto actually comes most naturally for guys. And it actually comes more naturally than the head voice. It's usually the head voice for men that has to be developed and trained. This makes sense, right? Because the falsetto feels most like the pre-changed voice for men. So it would be the one that feels the most natural to access at first. Examples of artists that use falsetto are Charlie Puth.
We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore like we used to do.
Maxwell. Now, there's one final register that we need to talk about. The one you've been waiting for. The Mariah Carey register. The Ariana Grande register. That one scene from Sister Act 2 register where that guy hits that crazy high note. The whistle register is the highest register that a human being can sing in. It also has a dotted border because not everybody has one, but both men and women can have one. The lucky ones, of course. The whistle register happens when literally only the back half of the vocal fold comes together. Cue Mariah Carey. In the next couple of videos, we're going to talk about the breaks between the vocal registers and also this mysterious concept of mixing. What is that? We'll find out. Until then, see you later.